Yeah, I thought of the topic of investigating the working conditions in the scene, especially the working conditions of individual freelance contemporary dance artists who mainly work project-based or who create their own jobs at least. When I was working, or I was actually doing an internship in Hamburg at Precarity, and I was working there as a production assistant. And often I was just sitting there in the kitchen after the training classes and just talking to the people who came to training or to the residents who were there at the time. And often the conversations were about money, or what are you gonna do next, or writing proposals or project applications, and like the conversation always turned to that. So that's where I already got interested in, is there research about this? What is the situation? And as I was coming from Belgium, and Brussels is really known as the dance capital, the European Mecca, they call it sometimes. So I thought, okay, maybe I see what the conditions are there, because if it's called the dance capital, then there should have good conditions, I supposed. But then I felt afterwards, working more and more in the scene, maybe it's not like that, and then why do people come there? And then from my experience in Hamburg, and I had a lot of exchange with Berlin. Also, my boyfriend was living in Berlin at the time, so I got to know the scene there, and I felt it was the same. There was the same kind of community of contemporary dance artists working in the same manner as Brussels. So I thought it would be interesting, because the living conditions are quite different in both cities, and maybe the funding systems are not the same, but especially the freelancing systems are quite different. So I thought it would be interesting to compare both. And yeah, the thing that really pushed me to do it was this symposium that was organized at the end of my internship in Hamburg by Angela Guerrero, and it was a symposium called Surviving Dance, and it was in the frame of the end of this funding program, Tanzplan Deutschland, and Kadrai, the choreographic center, was one of the venues that was started because of this funding program. So in this symposium, actually a lot of theorists that I work around now, they were speaking, like Gabriele Klein, for instance, was there. I believe even Bojana Kunst was there, and I didn't know them at the time. But everyone, and also a lot of artists were there, and they made a manifesto about what can they do to improve the working conditions, how can they find strategies to work outside of this funding program for dance. And that's where I really thought, okay, there is something really to be done, and maybe I can do something as a person. And since I was already in conversation with the universities to start a project, we decided to do some sort of comparative study between Brussels and Berlin and see how maybe both can learn from each other. But in the end, the study is not so comparative. It's actually more of, because people work in the same way, it's not really a comparison. It's really more like what are the working situations in these two cities that really pull a lot of international dance artists, and how can we improve them. But because I come from performance studies, what my interest then was is, okay, so if these precarious working conditions are there, how does that affect or influence the kind of work that is created? How can we see in the performances that are shown in these cities that the working conditions have affected these? And that's, from my performance studies background, my interest. Because I'm using sociological methods to do this research, which is a new approach and also new to me, so it was kind of also an experiment. And well, at first I thought I needed a quantitative approach to know what are the working conditions, because there are not so many statistics or numbers, and if there are numbers, they usually relate to the performing arts in general, and almost never to dance in specific. So I used the quantitative approach, but that was kind of my starting point. What is the status quo? And from the surveys that I took in both cities, I was able to set up, a list of criteria that could help me choose a couple of people in Berlin and in Brussels to follow long term, to have some sort of ethnographic study about them, which meant that in the end I took 7 case study informants in Brussels, and a year later I took 7 similar case study informants in Berlin. And with similar I mean I made sure that I had people of all ages, European, non-European, also different career, also maybe different niches that they worked in.
Is it possible to know the names, or
no, it's anonymous. But eventually, maybe after the study, I would always, in agreement with the person, publish some interviews or something that could be relevant for anyone. Mm-hmm. I especially also looked for people who had children, so I made sure that I had the same set of criteria for Brussels and for Berlin, so that I wouldn't stick to a certain niche. For instance, very typical, I wouldn't just pick people who studied at parts in Brussels. I would really have a sort of representative pool of people. And I conducted in-depth interviews with them over a course of 6 to 9 months. It really also depended on how mobile they were in those 6 months, because people don't work always in Berlin. I also had them make logbooks for me in which they documented their activities of the past 2, 3, 4 weeks, and I analyzed them and we talked about it and we went over it. So I really had an idea of what their days looked like and how they worked and what are the different work tasks people do. It's very different when people are working in a studio or when people are working from home. And then I also went into the studio with them whenever they had a creative process, which was unfortunately not so often. Sometimes I went into the studio when they were working for someone else. Sometimes I didn't have the chance to go into the studio with them, but I've been, in the scene, watching performances these people did with other people. So I've really done field work, that's what they call it.
Is it possible to mention one aspect of this artist work that you would say this is, for instance, a very good example that based on these conditions we get this type of work?
Yeah, I can give one example which is for me very clear. I can even say whose work it was because I've published an interview with this person. But for instance, in Brussels, I've spoken to David Hernandez, and he has recently created a piece danced by 3 dancers, one of which is himself. It's called Sketches for Scarlatti or Sketches on Scarlatti, I'm not sure about the title, which was a work already made in kind of obscure conditions because it was a commission, or not really, it was, there was I think a festival in Bonn, if I'm correct, and they asked him if he was interested to have a space for 2 weeks and make a work and show a work in progress during that festival. And he was like, yeah, I've had this idea for a long time, and then he created in 2 weeks a work with 2 people he wanted to work with, and in the end it was already quite finished when they showed it, and it was really welcomed by the people. And the work itself has no set, whereas his previous work had a big set. This work has no set at all. It just works with simple light. The 3 performers are also all from Brussels, so people don't have to travel there for rehearsals. It's actually a very simple piece, which means that he can sell it very cheap. And it doesn't need transportation, it doesn't need an extra technician. You can actually just be with 3 people, which also makes the price really low, because only the 3 people performing have to receive a fee. You don't have transportation costs. Also, the choreographer himself is dancing in the piece, which is something that happens more and more because being outside is just becoming too expensive. So overall, and what I think is also really interesting is, in the end, it's a very beautiful piece. Also, the choreographer himself is very happy about it. They kept on working on it later also. But in the end, the choreographer himself is also very aware that this piece was also strategic. Because even if it's a trio, because a trio is already more expensive than a solo, it can be sold cheap. Also, you don't need, that's something else he said, you don't need a lot of time to get back into the piece. So if you haven't performed it for a while, and you go perform it somewhere, you don't need 3 days or 5 days to get into it. In 1 day you can really set it up, get back, do a run through, and it's this kind of piece that is really easily reproducible. And I think that's also part of being strategic. And he's very aware of that, but he's also very satisfied with the result, which I think is a very nice example of your question.
Definitely.
Yeah. So in the survey I did for Berlin, I asked the question, I had a few kind of intrinsic characteristics of the profession listed, and I asked to how satisfied people were about these things, and I also asked what motivates people the most to be in this profession. For instance, one of the aspects or a few of the aspects that I listed were what motivates you the most? Is it artistic pleasure? Is it recognition? Is it autonomy? Is it self-development? I don't know by heart all the ones that I listed. But in the end, it was really interesting to see that most of the people indicated artistic pleasure as what drives them the most. So they had to give a top 3 of the things. So that was the most indicated in general in the top 3, but I believe it was also the most in the top. And actually, what was interesting about my survey is that I left interpretation sometimes up to the respondent. So I didn't give a definition when I said artistic pleasure. So it's up to me really to guess what they meant with artistic pleasure. For instance, I saw it as the pleasure of being creative, of having the freedom to making something. And that could be, for instance, that has to do also with collaboration with other people, researching. All these aspects for me are also linked to this big notion of artistic pleasure. I, of course, don't know how the respondents answered or interpreted this notion, but it's also something, I'm not just saying these definitions because I feel that's what it means, also because the interviews that I took kind of gave me a good impression of what people think or what drives people. And I think what drives people really in this profession is to have this relatively autonomous life where you can devote yourself into your creative practice. And that's really, what I thought was also interesting about it is because for them, that was listed as a top, and for instance, recognition was not ever mentioned in the top 3, so people don't really do it for anybody else. There's big discussions about how maybe this is selfish, or this is like Also self-development also again relies on the self. So do you do it for yourself? I think that can be a very interesting discussion. Don't know right now what I can say about it. I definitely have some opinions about it, I think. But I think also if you're not an artist, I like to do things for myself. And if I do things for others, and if things are appreciated by others, I am happy about it. So in my research, I talk a lot about self-precarization, which means, okay, to talk about self-precarization means that I first have to talk about precarization, and what does that mean? Precarity is, to say very easily, it's just socioeconomic insecurity. It means is that you are insecure, you have very unstable, unreliable future prospects. You, for instance, don't have any pension insurance, you don't know what your next job is going to be, you don't know how you're going to pay rent next week. So that's a very blunt, definition of precarity. And precarization means that this process is normalized by the state. What I mean by that is that, for instance, by supporting freelance jobs or freelance professions, or just being freelancer, it is kind of legalized to live in socioeconomic insecurity, because it is supported. Actually, a lot of governments encourage more and more people to become a freelancer, which means that they have to provide in their own insurances, for instance, in their pension. And because they have to provide in their own jobs, in their own contracts. So self-precarization is the other side to that, is that it's not only a process that is
systemic,
but it's also a process, a process that is your own choice, I would say. But the way that I see it, it is as much a choice as it is a coercion. So it's actually a notion coming from Isabel Laurie, who's a cultural studies theorist, and she says, especially in the creative professions, a lot of people self-precaritize because they are willing to sacrifice certain material income, which can be social security, but it can also just be literally money. And they are willing to sacrifice that because they can get something else in return, immaterial income or immaterial currencies, which could be it could be just the pleasure of doing whatever you want. It could be, okay, I will do this because you are my friend and you will do something else for me later in return. Or it could be, I will do this now in these unfair conditions that you propose to me because I think it's a good way to invest in my future, because it will increase my visibility and I will receive more recognition and I can put this on my CV. So it can be different reasons, but in general, so people are willing to sacrifice on certain things, to compromise, because they think they can get something else in return. And this kind of phenomenon happens a lot in the arts because it's one of the professions in which you are, very passionate about what you do. But I think in a lot of professions you are very passionate about what you do, and I don't think it's just a choice. I don't think it's something necessarily bad, this self-precarization. I think it is a choice to live that way, but it's also a coercion that is not supported. Of course you don't like to be precarious. It would be nice to have pension, but it's just not of a concern right now. So I think it's you have to be careful with this notion, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But of course, in the survey results, it maybe seem like that because of course it makes the artists that I've researched in a precarious socioeconomic position. Yeah, I think it's very interesting because you're absolutely right when I talk about this self-precarization. It's very much related to economy, but from my research, I also really experienced that it's so hard to research the work that artists do because it is so intermingled with life, and it's not like I can say, okay, from 2 till 4 you were working, and then from 4 till 5 you were not working. You can't do that. It's very entangled, and I think that's also a symptom of these times. I think it doesn't only happen in the arts. If I just take myself as an example, I also I don't know when I'm working and when I'm not working. When I'm talking to you, I am on the payroll, but should I consider this work, or is this just something I do because I want to do it? But I also want to do my job because I want to do it. So one of my conclusions is that I realized that a lot of the artists that I've been speaking to, they don't necessarily see their profession as a profession, but as a lifestyle. And that's something I'm really working around now, thinking about a profession rather than a vocation. I would say it's a lifestyle, and to maintain that lifestyle, of course, some parts need to be paid. So I think all these aspects, like what you said before about doing something in your free time, which is already difficult to define. What is your free time? For free, because you want to do it and your friends and peers are open to do it. It's like alternatives to economy. I would actually say it's rather also an economy itself. I think the art world is a very special kind of economy, and I think its strength can also be that it's a different economy than the work economy that is, the typical full-time permanent contract work economy. And I think that's also interesting. That's also one of the reasons why I investigate the way that dancers work, or dance artists, I prefer to say, because I feel like they are the paradigmatic example of what work is going to look like in the future. I think already a lot of other professions work this way. Most freelancers work this way. What I think is special about dance artists is that they are extremely transnationally mobile, and that is also reflected in the profession because their bodies are their means. And I think that is one of the things that really drives me to investigate contemporary dance artists, because that's how we're going to redefine work in the future. So I think it is an economy, and I think it's a very special economy.
At least my understanding of art in itself, by default, it attempts to open up also other ways of giving value to things that are not the ones that we already kind of know. And especially the economy is one of the dominant ones of how to give value to something. So also art tries also to a little bit to propose different ways of giving values. And from that perspective, this is what I mean, that not only art as the artwork we make, but also how we work can be artistic in itself. So we also claim that the way we do it is also another possible way of doing things. And for instance, from that perspective, I think that this is why I think that art is not like any other profession, because for instance, when we look at insecurity or instability or lack of future prospect, exactly, I think that there is no art without this. For me, one of the main or one of the momentums in the artistic practice is this moment of approaching the boundaries somehow, and you risk, because in many ways, you risk not only financially but also you risk with your own subjectivities, and to go through, you experiment with yourself or together with others, you put yourself in different conditions. So this idea of unknown or uncertainty, for me, is a little bit like the fuel of
it's what fuels. I think art is intrinsically precarious because you don't know what you're gonna make. Art is the possibility to do whatever. So I think definitely this aspect of doing whatever you want to do, and you don't know what, you know, if it's even gonna lead to anything, and if it does, what does it lead to? I think that's really an important aspect of art, and I think that's also something that should be supported in a way. But I think also just the system of applying for a project, and in that project application you need to already know what you're gonna do, that is a problem. That is also already against this aspect of creating art, because you have to have your product there. And I think what you were saying is also that what is unique to the art world is that you can work on something for a very long time without having a product. That it is very unique to just work for weeks and weeks on something and there is no outcome, and maybe no one will even see it except for you and the people you were collaborating with. And I think that's also very interesting, and I think that's a very difficult topic to discuss, like how are you going to support that, and that leads to artists having a basic income. But I absolutely agree with what you were saying. If artists would have a basic income and they would not be precarious anymore at all, what kind of art is then created? Because being in this position of having to, you know, work with whatever you have also makes you creative. So yeah. It's a very, I mean, I could talk for hours about this topic, but it's a conversation I have actually also with a lot of artists, and different ideas come up, and yeah, in our research project we're talking more and more about the notion of flexicurity, which is a very business management term, our notion that refers to increasing employability and giving social security while still allowing people to be flexible, which for instance happens in Brussels through the application of the employee status for freelance workers, which means they still have social security between their contracts, which means they still have unemployment allowances, which they don't use as unemployment allowances, but they use it as a way to cover all the unpaid work or the uncontracted work, which is for us a flexicurity notion. It allows you to work in this flexible way, doing what you want, but between those times that you are being paid or supported for your work, you still have something to rely on. You still, you know, you don't have to work in a bar to be able to pay your rent. You can use that time for your artistic concerns rather than doing a side job. Yeah. In my experience from my interviews in Berlin last year and the year before in Brussels, I hear a lot of the people that I've been working with talk about a loss of the sense of community because of the way the system works, because you're constantly busy applying for new projects, trying to keep your own work going, also networking your way around, trying to stay visible in the scene. And I just remember one of my informants saying something that stuck with me really, is that she said, I feel very selfish. I am not going in the studio anymore with other people because I need that time to work on getting my own work done. And I feel like the whole community has become very individualistic and everyone is really working their ass off to get their own work done. And this sense of community is lost. People don't come together for the sake of coming together. People don't offer themselves as an outside eye anymore because they just don't have time. They can use that time better for something else. This was a person from Brussels saying this, and I think yeah, that might be indeed a consequence of this system, of the project funding system, but also of the fact because these working conditions make you precarious or make you constantly, you have to ensure you constantly have something going on. Also, in the meantime, when you're not working, you still have to remain visible in the scene or people will forget you and you won't be supported the next time. So it's very, especially this networking takes up a lot of time, and it makes people, to really say it black and white, it makes people really self-involved rather than involved in the community. And yeah, that's just a shame.